The year was 1944. The war was still raging across Europe, but for thousands of captured German soldiers, it was already over. Shackled by defeat and exhaustion, they were packed into gray ships crossing the Atlantic. The sea was cold and endless, and most of them believed they were being taken to some kind of punishment. A miserable prison in a ruined, desperate America they'd been told was weak and broken. They had been raised on propaganda. They believed the United States was a land of chaos, filled with crime, hunger, and cheap machines that would crumble in real war. They had seen the glossy films of German factories, sleek steelworks, and perfect tanks rolling off assembly lines. They had been told that America could never match the discipline of German industry, nor the precision of its soldiers. For weeks, the journey was silent except for the waves. Some prayed, some stared into the gray sky. Others still whispered that perhaps the Führer would win in the end, that the Atlantic was just another battlefield to be crossed. Then one morning, after days of nothing but ocean, the fog lifted. A few soldiers standing near the railings looked up and saw it first, a distant skyline rising through the mist. At first, they thought it was smoke from factories burning, but as the ship drew closer, they realized the truth. It wasn't smoke. It was the glow of a city so vast that it stretched across the horizon. The men stared in silence. They were looking at New York City. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then one of the officers whispered, half in disbelief, "Mein Gott, it's endless." Towering cranes lined the harbor. Cargo ships waited in rows like a metallic army. Miles of factories pumped out smoke, each one larger than the towns they had come from. Trains clattered beneath steel bridges. Cars moved in every direction. Workers swarmed like an army of ants, efficient, relentless, alive. They had been told America was soft, weak, lazy. But what they saw was power. Power that stretched from one side of the horizon to the other. Power that didn't march in step. It roared in motion. One prisoner, decades later, would describe that moment as the day his world ended. "We realized," he said, "that we had already lost the war. Not because of bombs, not because of tanks, but because of what we saw that morning." That was the moment when thousands of German prisoners, soldiers of the so-called master race, stopped laughing. They had entered a new world, a world built not on fear or obedience, but on energy, abundance, and something they could barely comprehend: freedom. And as they stepped onto American soil for the first time, guarded yet unafraid, they would discover that the real weapon that won the war wasn't just the gun or the bomb. It was the machine that never slept, the unstoppable industrial heart of the United States of America. The journey began in silence. From the docks of Liverpool and Cherbourg, long lines of German prisoners shuffled aboard gray Liberty ships under the watchful eyes of American guards. They carried little more than tattered uniforms, worn boots, and the weight of defeat. Some still wore medals on their chests, reminders of a cause that had already crumbled behind them. The ocean stretched ahead like punishment itself. For days, all they saw was water, an endless gray plain under an iron sky. The wind cut through their coats, the smell of diesel and salt mixed with sickness as the ships rolled through rough Atlantic waves. Some prayed quietly. Others refused to speak at all. Inside the dark cargo holds, rumors spread like sparks in the gloom. "They're taking us to Alaska." "No, to work camps in the desert." "America has no food. They'll starve us." They had been told that the United States was weak, built on jazz and chaos, a place of corruption and disorder. Goebbels's propaganda had painted it as a land of decadent music, racial tension, and empty factories. Many believed the war would destroy America from within long before a single German soldier ever had to land there. And yet, as the days dragged on, something began to shift. The food on board, though rationed, was better than what most of them had eaten in months. Thick bread, canned meat, even coffee. One prisoner joked softly, "If this is how they feed prisoners, how do they feed soldiers?" A guard overheard him and smiled. "Better than you think, buddy." It was a small moment, but it stuck. The men began to notice other details. The guards weren't cruel. They didn't shout or hit. They gave water, shared cigarettes, even helped the seasick. It was confusing. These were supposed to be the barbarians of democracy, and yet they acted with calm professionalism. Every day, the Germans lined up for meals and looked out toward the horizon, waiting for land. The Americans moved through the ship with quiet efficiency, young, confident, almost casual. They didn't seem like men who were afraid of losing anything, and that confidence, that quiet strength, unsettled the prisoners more than anger ever could. One morning, near the halfway point of the voyage, the ship's engines slowed. A loudspeaker crackled with English instructions. The German prisoners didn't understand the words, but they felt the change. The guards pointed upward, and the men climbed to the deck. What they saw took their breath away. A convoy, dozens of ships stretching in every direction. Tankers, destroyers, cargo freighters, all moving in perfect formation. The sea itself seemed covered in American steel. The guards stood proudly as aircraft flew overhead in lazy circles, watching for submarines. It was a floating city, a machine of machines. One officer whispered, "So many ships. Where do they come from?" His comrade answered softly, "If this is only one convoy, imagine how many they still have." That realization hit harder than any battle. Germany had been struggling to replace every tank, every plane, every bullet. Yet here, the Americans treated entire fleets as routine. The prisoners looked around in silence, each one realizing what it meant. They weren't being taken to a country at war. They were being taken to a nation that manufactured war itself, one that could build faster than the world could destroy. And as the ships pressed on toward the western horizon, the Germans stopped wondering what their prison would look like. They began to wonder what kind of country had built a navy large enough to blot out the sea. The morning air was colder than they expected. After weeks of nothing but ocean, the horizon finally began to change. At first, it was a faint blur, a gray smudge rising through the fog. Then it grew, slowly, steadily, into something enormous. The prisoners crowded along the railings, squinting into the pale dawn. Even the guards fell quiet. Through the mist, the shape of a skyline began to emerge. Not ruins, not smoke, not destruction, but a city alive and awake. It was New York. What they saw didn't seem real. Dozens of skyscrapers pierced the clouds, glinting gold in the sunrise. The docks were a storm of movement, cranes lifting steel, trains whistling, trucks grinding across bridges that stretched farther than the eye could see. Tugboats weaved between giant cargo ships stacked high with crates. The air smelled of oil and industry, not ashes. One German lieutenant whispered to another, "They told us the Americans were starving. This is not a starving country." Another added quietly, "We've been lied to." As the ship pulled closer to the harbor, the prisoners' silence deepened. They could see workers everywhere, men and women, thousands of them, dressed in coveralls, welding, loading, shouting orders, laughing. Smoke poured from the factories beyond the river like banners of victory. In Germany, factories had become graveyards, bombed, broken, silent. But here, everything was moving. Everything was alive. One officer stared at the endless line of warehouses and muttered, "Every one of these could build aircraft." A guard standing nearby turned to him and said simply, "They already are." The prisoners looked up and saw it. A flight of bombers rumbling overhead in perfect formation, heading east. The ships trembled as they passed, and even the most hardened soldiers felt their stomachs drop. The power was overwhelming, effortless. For the first time, the idea of Germany winning the war felt like fantasy. As the ship entered the harbor, the Statue of Liberty appeared through the fog. The prisoners stared at it, confused. To them, liberty had always been propaganda, a slogan, not a reality. Yet the guards stood a little taller when they saw it, and the workers on the docks waved. These people weren't afraid. They weren't broken. They were proud. When the ship finally docked, the German officers noticed something else. There were no ruins, no craters, no rubble. The streets were clean, the buildings untouched. Streetcars rattled past lines of well-dressed civilians going about their day as if the war didn't exist. It was a world apart from the bombed-out cities of Europe. As they disembarked, each prisoner stepped onto American soil for the first time, some with fear, others with disbelief. The guards gave simple instructions, spoke politely, and guided them into waiting trains. The discipline was calm, not cruel. Through the train windows, the prisoners watched America roll by. Endless towns, roads full of cars, fields dotted with tractors, and factories so vast that smoke trailed for miles. Even in the countryside, they saw signs of industry. Mills, silos, power lines. Every town seemed self-sufficient, every worker busy. One soldier finally said it aloud, his voice trembling with something between awe and defeat. "If this is what their cities looked like while at war, what did they look like before?" The others didn't answer. They just stared out at the passing landscape, realizing that what they were seeing wasn't luck or propaganda. It was power, pure, mechanical, unstoppable power. A kind of strength they had never imagined. The propaganda had told them that Americans were lazy, distracted, and soft. But what they saw that day, as the train carried them deeper into the country, was the truth. America was a giant, and the war had only made it stronger. The journey inland took hours, sometimes days. Trains rumbled through endless stretches of farmland, past fields of wheat and rows of tractors that gleamed like polished steel. The German prisoners stared through the barred windows in disbelief. This was supposed to be a country at war, yet there was no hunger, no smoke, no ruins. The land seemed untouched, almost impossibly rich. When the trains finally stopped, the men were led off in neat columns toward their new reality. Prisoner of war camps scattered across America's heartland. Kansas, Texas, Georgia, Michigan, every region had its share. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but inside, what awaited them was not cruelty. It was something stranger. The barracks were clean. The beds had real mattresses. The kitchens smelled of stew and bread. The guards greeted them with calm instructions, not shouts. Medical tents stood ready with supplies. Even the latrines were orderly and sanitary. To men who had survived the mud of the Eastern Front and the rubble of Europe, it felt unreal. One prisoner later said, "When I saw the food line, I thought it was a trick." The meals were simple: beans, potatoes, meat, coffee. But there was enough for everyone. They received mail, books, even sports equipment. On Sundays, they were allowed church services. Some camps even had orchestras and theaters, built and run by the prisoners themselves. It wasn't freedom. but it was dignity. The Americans treated the rules of the Geneva Convention not as limits, but as obligations. Every man was accounted for, every request documented. There were no random beatings, no executions. Discipline was firm but fair. Guards and prisoners sometimes played soccer together. It was not friendship, at least not yet, but it was something human. And that humanity confused the Germans more than any weapon. They had expected humiliation. They had expected revenge. Instead, they found order without brutality, control without fear. It felt alien. The men began to ask themselves what kind of nation could afford to treat its enemies this well. One guard, noticing their confusion, said quietly, "We're not here to hate you. We're here to keep you safe until it's over." That single line spread through the camp faster than rumor. For many, it was the first time they had ever been treated as men rather than soldiers. The harsh discipline of their own army had taught them obedience through fear. The Americans taught them cooperation through respect. Weeks passed, and the camps began to feel like small towns. Workshops opened. POWs repaired tools, built furniture, and even helped on nearby farms. For every day's labor, they earned a few cents in camp scrip, money that could be spent in small canteens on cigarettes, postcards, or candy. It was a simple system, but it gave them back something they hadn't felt in years: purpose. And the more they worked, the more they saw. American supply trucks came daily, crates of food, fuel, and materials stacked higher than a man's head. None of it seemed scarce. There was always more. The guards joked that the only thing America might run out of was storage space. The prisoners began to realize that this abundance wasn't an illusion. It was the natural state of a country that had mastered production. Even at war, even while sending armies across oceans, America had enough to feed its enemies comfortably. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We believed the war was about ideology. But here, I see that it was about factories." At night, the men gathered outside the barracks, looking toward the horizon where the faint glow of distant cities lit the sky. They could almost hear the hum of engines, the rhythm of machines, the heartbeat of a nation that never stopped working. For the first time, the prisoners began to understand something their leaders had never told them. The war wasn't lost in the trenches or the skies. It had been lost on the assembly line. The prisoners thought they had already seen America's power when they arrived: the trains, the cities, the food, but nothing prepared them for what they saw when they began to work outside the fences. Many were assigned to nearby farms, lumber mills, or factories, guarded by a few soldiers who often stood back, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. There were no dogs, no chains, no shouting. The prisoners were trusted, not because they were free men, but because America didn't seem afraid of them. That confidence was more humbling than any punishment could have been. At first, the men expected small, struggling farms. What they found instead were operations so vast and organized they looked like military campaigns. Endless rows of machines, tractors, harvesters, irrigation systems moved in rhythm across the fields. The barns were stocked with modern tools. Silos gleamed silver under the sun. Everything worked, and everything was abundant. One German farmer from Bavaria stood beside an American combine and shook his head. "We were told they were lazy," he muttered. "Lazy people don't build machines like this." Factories were the same. Those chosen to repair equipment or load freight trains found themselves in buildings that roared with sound and light. Conveyor belts stretched for hundreds of meters. Sparks flew as welders built tank hulls, aircraft wings, and engines faster than the eye could follow. Women worked shoulder to shoulder with men, sleeves rolled up, their movements quick and precise. What stunned the prisoners most was how normal it all seemed. The workers laughed, sang, smoked during breaks. There was no fear, no overseer screaming orders, no Gestapo watching for disobedience. And yet, the production never stopped. They had been told that America was undisciplined, chaotic, driven by greed. But what they saw was a kind of order that didn't need a whip. It was discipline born from pride, not fear. Every week, new trains arrived, hundreds of boxcars loaded with food, weapons, and fuel. Every week, new machines left the factories and rolled toward the ports. It was a cycle that seemed infinite, unstoppable. One POW, a former engineer, wrote in his diary, "In Germany, we worshipped the machine. In America, they live with it." At night, the lights of the nearby towns glowed against the sky. Electric power, available everywhere. Cars moved along the highways even in the dark. The prisoners could hear music from radios drifting through open windows, jazz and swing, the soundtrack of a nation that felt alive. They realized, slowly, that they were inside something greater than a military system. They were inside an ecosystem of energy and abundance. When asked later what had shocked them most, it wasn't the food or the treatment. It was the scale, the sheer magnitude of what America could produce. "We believed we were the masters of industry," one prisoner recalled, but in America, industry itself was the master. Some began to question everything they had been taught. The Nazi world had been built on control and scarcity, the belief that power came from domination. Here, power came from creation. The factories ran not on fear, but on purpose. One afternoon, while working near a railroad depot, a prisoner watched a freight train thunder past, hauling tanks on flat cars, jeeps, and crates, marked Pacific. It stretched on for miles, clattering into the horizon. The guard beside him said, "That's just one shipment. They'll send another tonight." The German looked at him, astonished. "Do you ever stop?" The guard grinned. "America doesn't stop." That phrase stuck in his mind. He repeated it in his diary that night. "They have built a nation that never sleeps. And because of that, we can never catch up." The prisoners began to understand that they weren't just witnessing a powerful country. They were witnessing a different idea of civilization. One where freedom didn't lead to chaos, but to creativity. Where ordinary people could build extraordinary things without a dictator's command. And in that realization, something inside them began to crack. The pride that had once made them see themselves as superior began to fade, replaced by respect, and, quietly, by envy. They had come as soldiers of an empire. They were becoming witnesses to something greater. For months, the prisoners had seen America through fences and factory smoke, but it wasn't until they began to meet ordinary Americans face to face that the true shock set in. They had been told that democracy was weakness, that too much freedom would turn a nation soft, selfish, and divided. Yet the people they met were the opposite. The guards were confident but fair. The farmers were independent but kind. Even the factory foremen who barked orders did so without cruelty. There was power here, but it didn't come from fear. It came from freedom. At first, the POWs couldn't understand it. In Germany, freedom had meant chaos. Here, it meant pride. Everyone seemed to carry a quiet certainty that they mattered, that their work, their choices, even their laughter had value. And that idea, more than any bomb or weapon, began to undo the prisoners' beliefs. One farmer in Oklahoma became a symbol of this revelation. His name was Thomas Reeves, a tall, weathered man who owned hundreds of acres of golden wheat. Each morning, he arrived at the camp gates with his truck to collect 10 German laborers to help harvest. He treated them not as prisoners, but as workers. He gave them water, bread, and shade during breaks. Once, when a young POW accidentally broke a tool and braced for punishment, Reeves only smiled and said, "You'll fix it tomorrow." That's how we learn. The man had expected anger. What he received instead was grace. He never forgot it. Others experienced the same strange humanity. In Texas, a group of prisoners was assigned to pick fruit in the orchards near San Antonio. The women who worked alongside them, mothers, wives, teenagers, chatted freely, sometimes offering sandwiches or lemonade. One young woman even taught a POW how to use a new American harvester, laughing as she showed him the controls. When he hesitated, she said, "It's easy. Just trust yourself." That simple sentence lingered in his mind for years. Trust yourself. In Germany, no one had ever said that. You trusted only authority, not your own judgment. Yet here, even in wartime, Americans lived by it. Slowly, suspicion turned into fascination. The POWs began to ask questions. Why were the guards so calm? Why did farmers and factory workers seem so proud of their jobs? Why were people free to speak openly, even criticize their leaders, without fear? The answers were always the same. Because they could. In one camp in Iowa, a guard named Sergeant Lawson spoke fluent German and often chatted with the prisoners. One night, a curious soldier asked him, "Why don't you hate us?" Lawson thought for a moment and said, "Because you're not the ones who started it. You just believed what you were told." The man looked down, ashamed. "We believed we were fighting for greatness." Lawson nodded. "We're fighting for peace." That's the difference. That conversation spread through the camp like wildfire. Dozens of prisoners began writing letters home, letters they knew might never be delivered, describing the strange kindness of their captors. They wrote of Americans who worked without fear, who lived without rationing, who smiled without suspicion. They wrote of a country that had mastered war without losing its soul. Some of the older officers refused to believe it. "It's all a performance," one insisted. "They want to make us weak." But even he couldn't deny what he saw. The guards joked, sang, and shared newspapers. The camp radio played swing music at night. And when the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the same Americans who had defeated Germany allowed the prisoners to celebrate too. For the first time, the men heard that the war was truly over, and that they would one day go home. Some cried. Others simply stared into the distance, trying to make sense of the world they had discovered behind barbed wire. They realized that they had not been captured by soldiers, but by an idea stronger than any army. The idea that a nation built on trust could outproduce one built on fear. As one German later wrote, "We had been told that freedom was disorder. In America, we saw that freedom was discipline without chains. And that was what defeated us." When the first letters were allowed out of the camps, the men wrote carefully. Every word was censored, every envelope stamped and inspected. But even between the black lines of ink where the censor's marker had cut them short, the truth slipped through. The tone was always the same: disbelief, humility, and something close to awe. "Mother, we are treated fairly here. They give us food. Real food. We work, but no one beats us. America is not what we were told." The letters that survived became small windows into their awakening. One officer wrote home from a camp in Nebraska, "Everywhere you look, they have machines. For every man, there are 10 engines working for him. Even the farmers have radios and tractors." If we had had this strength, we could have conquered the world. But now I see they built all this not for war, but for life. Another letter from Georgia read, "The Americans live as if they have already won, even before the war ended. They laugh, they share, they argue, they build. If this is democracy, then it is not weakness. It is victory inside the camps." The men began to talk differently. The arrogance that had once filled their conversations was fading. The certainty that Germany was superior no longer felt solid. Instead, there was curiosity and confusion. Why had they been told to hate people who seemed so normal? How could a country with such abundance not crave conquest? And how could the Americans trust even their enemies enough to feed them well, pay them fairly, and let them work with freedom? The answers came slowly, in fragments. The chaplains who visited spoke about freedom of conscience. The guards, when asked about their families, spoke with pride about wives who worked in factories or children who went to school. It was a different kind of patriotism, not blind loyalty, but belief in something shared. One day, a young POW named Eric Weber was assigned to repair fences near the camp perimeter. On the other side of the wire, local children played, waving sticks like swords. They shouted to him in broken German, "Hey, Kraut, you want candy?" Laughing, they tossed a handful of sweets through the fence. Weber hesitated, then bent down to pick them up. The guard watching nearby smiled. "They don't know who you are," he said. "They just know you look hungry." That moment stayed with Weber for the rest of his life. In Germany, he later said, children were taught to hate. In America, they were taught to share. As months turned into years, the camps changed. The fences stayed, but the hostility melted. The prisoners built theaters, orchestras, and schools. They studied English, economics, and philosophy. Many asked for books about democracy, ideas they had once dismissed as naive. The Americans didn't stop them. They encouraged it. Some prisoners even began teaching German literature and history, carefully edited to remove the lies they had once believed. They held debates about what had gone wrong, how a country of poets and thinkers had surrendered its soul to madness. For the first time, they spoke of guilt, quietly, carefully. But they spoke. In one camp newsletter, handwritten and circulated secretly, a former Nazi youth leader wrote an article titled, "The Real Victory." "We came here as soldiers of the Reich, believing in our destiny. But we discovered something greater. The Americans defeated us not with hate, but with abundance. They built more, shared more, and believed more. They did not conquer our bodies. They conquered our beliefs." By the end of 1945, something profound had happened. The men were no longer just prisoners. They were witnesses to a truth that their own nation had hidden from them. They began to see the war not as a clash between armies, but between ideas: fear versus faith, obedience versus individuality, control versus creativity. And every time they sat down to write home, they tried, within the limits of censorship, to describe that revelation. "Tell Father," one man wrote, "that everything we thought we knew about the world was wrong." The ink on those letters faded with time, but their meaning didn't. Many of the men who sent them would return to Germany as different people, humbled, thoughtful, and determined to rebuild their country into something that resembled the place that had once imprisoned them. Because for the first time in their lives, they had seen what real freedom looked like. And it didn't look like chaos. It looked like America. By 1946, the war had ended, but the lessons were just beginning. Across the American heartland, the barbed wire remained. but the fear that once separated prisoner and guard had faded into something unexpected: respect. In the quiet fields and dusty workshops, the former enemies had become something else entirely. They had become students. Every camp now had a rhythm that felt more like a small town than a prison. There were morning roll calls, work shifts, and evening discussions. But more and more, the focus shifted from labor to learning. The U.S. Army and the YMCA began distributing books, not propaganda, but real education: history, economics, literature, even political philosophy. The guards called it reorientation. The prisoners called it awakening. At first, many were skeptical. They assumed the classes were just another form of indoctrination. But the Americans didn't lecture. They let the prisoners question. When someone asked, "Why would a country teach its enemies?" an officer simply said, "Because someday you'll go home. And we'd rather send back thinkers than soldiers." That answer struck a chord. The men began to take the classes seriously. They debated democracy, capitalism, and ethics with a passion that surprised even their teachers. Former German engineers studied American factory design. Farmers studied agricultural management. Some learned English through newspapers and shared them among barracks at night, circling words they didn't understand. One German officer, Captain Dieter Klein, became fascinated with American economics. He had spent years in the Reich's Planning Bureau, where production was driven by fear and punishment. Watching American workers, he realized something profound. They build faster because they believe they are free to fail. We were never free to fail, so we were never free to succeed. That idea spread like wildfire. The prisoners started organizing their own classes. They taught each other trade skills, mechanics, and even civics. In one camp in Colorado, they built a full model of a democratic parliament out of scrap wood, complete with voting booths and debates. It was meant as a learning exercise, but it turned into something deeper. They were practicing the world they wanted to return to. Meanwhile, American guards watched with cautious pride. They had not planned to transform their captives into students of democracy, but that was exactly what was happening. Every day, men who had once worn the swastika began quoting Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. They debated human rights and freedom of speech, concepts they had once been told were weaknesses. In Kansas, a group of POWs started a camp newspaper written in both English and German. The first headline read, "Tomorrow belongs to understanding." The editors wrote, "If the war taught us anything, it is that hatred is inefficient. The Americans defeated us because they invested in education instead of fear." Evenings became moments of reflection. Some nights, the prisoners gathered under the open sky to listen to the guards' radios. They heard jazz, political speeches, news of Reconstruction in Europe. One evening, when President Truman's voice came through the static, speaking about rebuilding Germany, the men fell silent. They couldn't believe their ears. The leader of the country that had destroyed their homeland was promising to help rebuild it. One prisoner whispered, "They are going to save the people who tried to kill them." For many, that was the final revelation. The Americans had not only defeated their army, they were now preparing to feed, educate, and restore their nation. The prisoners realized that victory for America wasn't about revenge. It was about progress. By the end of 1946, repatriation began. One by one, the camps emptied. The trains that had once carried soldiers into captivity were now carrying home students, men with notebooks, English dictionaries, and plans. They no longer dreamed of empire. They dreamed of democracy. When those ships crossed the Atlantic again, this time heading east, the prisoners stood on deck as free men. They no longer felt shame, only determination. They had seen what industry looked like without cruelty, what freedom looked like without chaos, and what victory looked like without hate. And many of them would carry that memory for the rest of their lives. When they stepped off those ships into the ruins of post-war Germany, they did not just bring hunger and loss. They brought knowledge, the kind that cannot be taken in war. Because inside the fences of those American camps, an empire had fallen, and a democracy had been born. When the ships left the American ports for the last time, the men crowded the rails just as they had when they first arrived. But now the mood was different. There was no fear, no defiance, only a heavy silence and the weight of what they carried home. Their hands were empty, but their minds were full. The voyage back to Europe was long and quiet. Many stood on deck for hours, staring at the fading skyline of New York. They watched the towers shrink into the distance, the smoke from the factories rising into the clouds, and they realized that they were leaving behind something more than a country. They were leaving behind an idea. When they reached Europe, the contrast hit like a punch to the chest. The ports of Bremen and Le Havre were ruins. The docks were twisted metal, the cranes broken and rusted. Cities that had once been symbols of pride were now graveyards of brick and ash. Roads were cratered. Children scavenged for food. The smell of smoke and dust hung in the air. The men stepped onto the soil of their homeland, and it didn't feel like home anymore. In the distance, church bells rang, hollow and cracked. They passed through towns where entire neighborhoods had been erased. Families huddled in cellars. There were no trains running, no lights at night. Germany had become a ghost of itself. One former officer looked around and whispered, "We built a 1,000-year Reich." It lasted 12, but among the despair, there was something else. Resolve. The men who had seen America knew that this didn't have to be the end. They had seen what a nation could look like when it believed in creation instead of domination. They had seen the difference between power built on fear and power built on freedom. And they brought that knowledge with them. In small towns and shattered cities, former POWs began to rebuild. Some became engineers, teachers, and mayors. Others reopened factories, farms, and schools. They taught what they had learned behind the fences: the discipline of cooperation, the value of trust, and the power of democracy. They told their families that strength didn't come from cruelty, but from unity. One man in Würzburg started a workshop for apprentices. He hung a single sentence on the wall: "Work like an American. Think like a human." Another in Bavaria reopened his family's farm using techniques he'd seen in Oklahoma. He wrote to his former guard in the U.S., thanking him for teaching him to drive a tractor. "Your kindness," he wrote, "has become the seed of my harvest." In Hamburg, a group of returnees formed a local council dedicated to rebuilding the town hall. When asked where they got their ideas for democratic procedure, one of them smiled and said, "From a model parliament we built in Colorado." Across Germany, this quiet transformation took root. It didn't happen overnight, but it spread. The POWs who had seen America's freedom became quiet teachers, influencing post-war Germany from the ground up. Their experiences shaped minds that would later form the backbone of the new democratic republic. And as the Marshall Plan arrived, bringing food and funds to rebuild Europe, many of those same men became the bridge between two worlds, the defeated and the victorious. They understood both, and they carried no hatred for either. One of them said years later, "When I came back, I saw rubble, but I also saw opportunity. The Americans showed me that a destroyed city is only a city waiting to be rebuilt." It was in those ruined streets, amid the ashes of their lost empire, that the first seeds of a new Germany began to grow. A Germany built not on conquest, but on cooperation. They had entered America as prisoners of war. They returned to Germany as students of peace. And as they rebuilt their homeland, they carried with them the quiet thunder of what they had witnessed, a nation that had won not through destruction, but through creation. The war had ended, but the lesson of America's power had just begun. The years after the war were a blur of rebuilding, rationing, and reckoning. Germany was split in two, the East under Soviet control, the West under Allied guidance. But amid the rubble, something remarkable began to stir. It came quietly, from men who had once been enemies, men who had seen the inside of American camps, and returned home with a different kind of loyalty. They were no longer soldiers, they were builders, and what they built would outlast every bomb that had ever fallen. In factories rising from the ashes of Cologne and Munich, former POWs applied what they had learned about American efficiency. Assembly lines moved faster, workers were treated as partners instead of tools, and managers spoke of teamwork instead of punishment. "You cannot build a nation with fear," one factory owner said. "You can only build with faith." Those who had labored on American farms introduced new techniques: irrigation systems, crop rotation, and mechanical harvesters. Within a few years, the German countryside began to recover. Wheat fields returned, markets reopened, children stopped scavenging and started going to school again. But the real legacy wasn't just economic. It was psychological. In the West, the democratic ideals that had once seemed alien began to take root. The men who had seen America's fairness inside the camps now served on local councils and in community boards. They taught their neighbors that debate was not disloyalty, that dissent was not rebellion. They had lived in a country where freedom was normal, and they wanted that for their own. One former POW named Kurt Reinecke became a teacher in Hanover. Every year he told his students the same story. "I learned democracy in a place surrounded by barbed wire. The guards were my first teachers. They showed me that respect is stronger than fear." Never forget that another, Hans Müller, worked in a steel factory that had once forged weapons for the Reich. Under his direction, it began producing farm tools and engines for civilian use. When asked why, he said simply, "Because this time, we will build things that last." In thousands of small ways, these men shaped the conscience of a new Germany. Their respect for American ideals did not make them submissive. It made them determined to prove that democracy could thrive on their own soil. They carried memories of abundance, fairness, and hope, and those memories became blueprints for renewal. By the 1950s, as West Germany rose from the ruins to become an industrial powerhouse once again, many of these former POWs played quiet but vital roles. They were factory supervisors, engineers, teachers, mayors, and civic leaders. Some even returned to America as guests, shaking hands with the same guards who had once watched over them. At reunions decades later, American veterans were astonished by the gratitude they received. One recalled meeting a German man in his 60s who had tears in his eyes as he said, "You taught me how to live free by showing me how you worked." It was an unexpected friendship, forged not in battle, but in understanding. The lesson had traveled across oceans and generations. That strength without compassion collapses, but compassion without strength endures. That freedom, when combined with discipline and purpose, is the most productive force on earth. The world saw that truth reflected in the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. In less than a decade, the country transformed from ruin to prosperity. But beneath the statistics and factories, something deeper was at work. a moral recovery. And at its heart were those men who had once been prisoners in a faraway land, men who had seen the lights of New York pierce the fog and realized that power was not about conquest, but about creation. One of them summed it up years later in a letter to his son. "We lost the war, but we won something greater, the chance to learn. The Americans defeated us with kindness, and we repaid them by becoming better men." By the time the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, many of these former POWs were already old, but their influence lived on in every free election, every honest debate, every factory that valued its workers, and every classroom that taught democracy as more than an ideal. Their captivity had become their education. Their defeat had become their redemption. And the thunder they had once feared from across the Atlantic now echoed quietly in their hearts. The steady rhythm of progress, of peace, of freedom. Because the true victory of World War II was not written in smoke or blood. It was written in understanding. In the end, the story of the German prisoners was not about captivity. It was about discovery. Men who had once marched under banners of iron and fear crossed an ocean expecting punishment, and instead found understanding. They had expected hunger and found abundance. They had expected hatred and found dignity. They had been told that democracy was weakness, that only control could build greatness. But they saw with their own eyes that freedom could organize itself into something far stronger. A system where every worker mattered, every voice counted, and every machine turned because people believed in what they were building. And when those men went home, that belief crossed the ocean with them. It spread through the factories and fields of West Germany, through the classrooms and offices of a nation learning how to stand again. They rebuilt not because they were commanded to, but because they had seen what belief in progress could create. What they learned in those American camps became part of something much larger, the quiet rebuilding of the modern world. They had entered the war as soldiers of an empire that worshipped fear, and they left it as witnesses to a truth that changed them forever. That real power doesn't come from obedience, it comes from purpose. That a free society, when united, can outbuild, outthink, and outlast any empire. In the silence of those camps, between the fences and the fields, the most unlikely classroom in history was born. America had not only defeated its enemies on the battlefield, it had educated them through example. One former prisoner said it best years later, "They showed us that you can win a war without killing a man's hope." That is the legacy that remains, the lesson written not in blood, but in kindness. The realization that mercy can be mightier than fear, and that the truest victory is not the destruction of an enemy, but the transformation of his heart. And long after the factories fell silent, long after the guards went home and the barbed wire was torn down, that lesson still echoed across the Atlantic, not as the sound of engines or explosions, but as the quiet, steady hum of progress, the hum of freedom, the hum of the machine that never slept, the hum of America.